Hey there, Nostalgics. Welcome back to another review here on the Nostalgia Factor, where we take a look at the best and worst in gaming. In today's edition of Nostalgic Blast, guys, I haven't really covered a game like this from a AAA company in quite some time, but let's just get into it. Developed and released by Square Enix back in 2001, today we're going to be reviewing the PS2 classic...
The Bouncer!
Yeah, that one. When the Bouncer was originally unveiled back in 2001, the initial premise was that Square Enix, they wanted to go and create an action movie beat-em-up game, a genre of game that they never really delved into much before, given all the RPGs that they've worked on from the Final Fantasy series. Of course, whenever you look at the reception of the Bouncer after it released back in 2001 with very poor sales and mixed reviews, this clear implementation and experimentation in the beat-em-up genre from Square, it kind of showed that it wasn't really their forte. Now, you might be asking yourselves, though, despite that criticism back then, does the Bouncer actually hold up in any way today? And I'm here to tell you guys, from someone who played the Bouncer a few years ago for the first time, this isn't one of Square's good games. In fact, this is probably one of the more mediocre games I played over the past few years. And that's saying something coming from a AAA company. There's one glaring flaw with the Bouncer right off the bat when it comes to looking at the story, which is virtually non-existent in itself, and it's something that presents a pretty glaring issue for someone, especially back in the day, if you were going to pay full retail price of $60 for it. The whole game is only 2 hours long. Yes, you heard that correctly. You can beat the entirety of the Bouncer across 3 separate campaigns in about 2 hours. This is by far one of the shortest video games that I've ever played, and given all the budget and production work that went into the Bouncer for the CG cutscenes, for the top-notch PS2 visuals at the time, around the time when the console was first released, and given the fact that Square Enix has such a reputation of creating massive games, that really says something for the Bouncer's quality, because the story length, regardless of it being 2 hours or not, it isn't very good. You have a group of friends from a nightclub called the Bulldogs that go and try and rescue a friend of theirs that was kidnapped by a shadowy organization, and that's really all you get with this plot. There's a lot of random stuff that happens throughout each of these 3 campaigns, because you can choose any one of the 3 gang members that you want to experience their stories. But in all honesty, there isn't really anything notable to talk about. They try and flesh out some backstories for each of these guys as you're going through the various locations and eventually infiltrating the big bad guy organization HQ in order to take them down. But the character relationships are pretty weak. The backstories aren't very interesting. There's very limited dialogue for everyone involved, and just random stuff happens in the game. There's a virtually non-existent story here that they attempt to try and create some kind of cohesive narrative with, but it's pretty non-existent in the Bouncer when it comes down to it. There isn't really anything for me to talk about because it's a bunch of random stuff that's just really undercooked. And again, it is 2 hours long. Even if that's per campaign, it is basically 2 to 4 hours of nothingness.
I beat him! I beat him, Dominique!
You could never understand the humiliation that I have gone through. The burden of having to be the best, of having to be worthy!
You think I'm gonna lose to someone who's only motivated by resentment?
This can't be.
I'm a bouncer. I make a living putting my life on the line.
Good. Good. I never expected anyone to push me so far.
I wanted to get the story part of this video out of the way right away, because the story in this game isn't very good whatsoever. It's incredibly short, it's pretty bland, and there really isn't anything to talk about with any of your main characters. And I know that that story segment may have sounded pretty brief to those of you who even played the game in the past, but that's really what it is. It's just not very good. And one thing I can say, though, on a more positive note, outside of the lackluster plot, is that the game visually does look good. Square Enix did have one consistent thing with a lot of this era of experimentation with some of their early PS2 games, and that was the visuals, because they really do pull out all the stops when it comes to using the PS2 tech back in the early 2000s. The character models look nice, the backgrounds, the fighting animations, the moving set pieces like the trains when you're going through the subway terminal, and even some of the CG cutscenes that they include is still pretty damn impressive. I have to say, I can't really fault Square, especially when they were creating the bouncer, on the visual side of things. I think it's good. Now, the music and the soundtrack in this game, which is something that you absolutely, I think, need to nail with fighting games or beat-em-up games in general, it's fine for the bouncer. I mean, it's better than the story, I'll say that much. The soundtrack can be entertaining at points. It can definitely make for some better music for some of the more epic moments in the game, some of the fight sequences, and some of the story cutscenes. But this soundtrack really isn't anything noteworthy to talk about either. I mean, what you see is what you get. It's a simple soundtrack. Definitely nothing compared to the works of Nobuo Uematsu from some of the other games Square worked on. But visuals are pretty impressive, and the soundtrack, kind of nothing like the story. At this point in the video, for some of you guys wondering, I've basically just been crapping all over the bouncer at this particular point, especially in terms of a lackluster soundtrack and a very brief story rundown that virtually leads up to nothing, because that's pretty much what the entirety of the bouncer's plot is. But given the fact that this was an experimental title from Square, how does the gameplay stack up when it comes to a beat-em-up game? You know, yeah, it's a short game, and yeah, the story isn't really worth experiencing, but does the gameplay compensate for that in any way? Given the fact that we have 3 playable characters here, with unique fighting styles, button combinations, and of course, just having a fun beat-em-up experience. Does any of that happen here? Nope. Unfortunately, the gameplay falls into the same category as the story and pretty much everything else I've talked about up to this point with the bouncer. To keep it simple, it doesn't matter which one of the 3 guys that you select. The gameplay is extremely repetitive, the moves are samey across all 3 guys, with the exception of a few unique moves that each of them can do. You're walking through wide and boring environments across each of the levels, just doing nothing but randomly hitting buttons on your PS2 controller trying to take down the next guy with a terrible dodge move. Basically just fighting waves upon waves of enemies, progressing through the already very short and mediocre story, and not really having any unique gameplay features in general. You're doing the exact same thing over and over again with no unique moves, and there's no real difference again between the 3 guys. The gameplay here just isn't fleshed out for a beat-em-up or fighting game experience, despite any unique features that, again, each of the 3 guys have. At the end of the day, what we're looking at here is a very repetitive and boring beat-em-up gameplay system. We're going from level to level, just beating the crap out of guys, and that's really it. It gets old after a while, and that really does say something for a game this short. The gameplay really isn't anything impressive, and it gets old after a while.
Hey, come on! And
that is the bouncer on PlayStation 2. When I was looking back on this game for the video, I was really hoping to find some more positive aspects of it to talk about, given the fact that Square Enix is my favorite video game company because of the work on Final Fantasy and so many other amazing games. And that is the sole reason why I picked up The Bouncer. It's a more obscure Squaresoft or Square Enix game nowadays that released on the PS2, which is my favorite console. The stars kind of seem to align on this one, and I figured I'd give it a shot. Unfortunately, the time that I spent with The Bouncer basically equated to the opinion of everybody else when this game launched back in 2001, with it being just a very drab and bland experience. The story isn't very good, there's no real characterization for any of your cast, non-existent soundtrack, pretty impressive visuals I'll give you, but the visuals don't compensate for the boring and repetitive gameplay. And unfortunately, that's what we have here. A pretty mediocre title from Squaresoft and a mediocre beat-em-up game. If you guys are curious to check out The Bouncer as an oddity, maybe you're a Square Enix fan, maybe you're just kind of curious to see this one for yourself, definitely go and check it out if you're curious, but I can't honestly recommend it on the premise of it being a good game, because this one really isn't good. I wouldn't call it a horrible one, because there was some effort put into it at points, but The Bouncer, all in all, is a pretty mediocre PS2 and beat-em-up game, and definitely not one of Square's shining games that they've released over the past several years. And that is it for today's video, guys. Thank you very much for checking out this review of The Bouncer on PS2. It was nice covering another obscure game here on the channel, since The Bouncer, for better or worse, doesn't really get a ton of attention anymore. So I'm glad to have done another video and maybe make some of you viewers out there aware of its existence. But thank you guys for checking this one out once again. Let me know your thoughts and feelings on The Bouncer and the video in the comment section down below. If you played this one, if you get any enjoyment out of it, maybe you agree with me and the thousands of other people out there who played this game back in the day. If you do, if you don't, let me know down below. And if you guys did enjoy the review, give it a like. It does help out the channel and the video in general. And subscribe to the channel if you guys want to catch up with future videos like this in the future. Future game reviews, collection pickups, and, of course, collaborations with other creators in the gaming community. But, yeah, that's all from me. And until next time, guys, this has been Ryan from the Nostalgia Factor saying, keep on gaming.